Picture this. You're 14 years old, shipped off to marry a complete stranger in a foreign country where everyone already hates you, and your biggest crime? Eating cake. Well, allegedly, Marie Antoinette never actually said let them eat cake, but somehow that fake quote became more famous than anything she actually did say, which is pretty ironic, considering what she really said and did was far more scandalous than any pastry-related proclamation. But here's the thing about history. The truth is always messier, more human and infinitely more fascinating than the legend. If you're ready to separate the woman from the myth and discover why Marie Antoinette's real story makes every royal scandal look like amateur hour, you're in the right place. Let's start with something that'll make your modern dating problems seem absolutely trivial. Imagine your mother, not suggesting, not hinting, but literally commanding, that you marry someone you've never met, in a country you've never visited, speaking a language you barely understand, and oh, by the way, this marriage will determine the fate of two major European powers, so no pressure. This was Marie Antoinette's Tuesday. Born Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna in 1755, she was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. 15th. Her mother had basically turned childbirth into a full-time career, and each kid was a potential political chess piece. Maria Theresa wasn't just any mother. She was the Holy Roman Empress, a woman who could start wars with a strongly worded letter and end them with a marriage contract. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its grandiose name, was basically medieval Europe's most complicated relationship status. Its complicated doesn't even begin to cover it. Voltaire famously quipped that it was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire, which is perhaps history's most savage burn delivered in the politest possible way. But Maria Theresa? She knew exactly how to play this game. She'd already married off several daughters to secure various alliances, treating the European marriage market like some sort of diplomatic eBay. Need to secure the southern borders, marry a daughter to the King of Naples, want to strengthen ties with France? Well, that's where our Marie Antoinette comes in. The target was Louis Auguste, the future Louis XV of France. He was awkward, obsessed with locksmithing, yes, locks, and had all the charisma of wet cardboard, but he was also the heir to the French throne, which made him Europe's most eligible bachelor by default. It's amazing what a crown can do for your dating profile. Young Maria Antonia was reportedly beautiful, vivacious and charming, everything her future husband wasn't. She had golden hair, bright blue eyes, and that effortless Austrian confidence that would later be mistaken for French arrogance. But here's what's fascinating. She was also incredibly naive. At 14, she genuinely believed that being queen would be like playing dress-up forever. The marriage negotiations took years. Imagine your parents haggling over your bride price while you're trying to figure out algebra. Both sides had to agree on dowries, territories, trade agreements, and about 1,000 other political details that would make a modern prenup look like a grocery list. Meanwhile, France and Austria had been enemies for centuries. The War of Austrian Succession had ended just a few years before Marie Antoinette's birth, and French nobles still viewed Austria as their traditional enemy. So this marriage wasn't just uniting two people. It was attempting to heal a wound that had been bleeding for generations. Think about it this way. Imagine if your country's biggest rival suddenly suggested that their princess marry your prince, and everyone just agreed. The French court was skeptical, to put it mildly. They called it the Austrian alliance, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. But Maria Theresa was determined. She'd already proven that a woman could rule an empire, something most European men found deeply unsettling. And now she was going to secure her legacy through strategic marriage alliances. She was basically playing 4D chess, while everyone else was still figuring out checkers. The irony is beautiful in its tragedy. Marie Antoinette was being sent to France to symbolize peace between two nations, but she would ultimately become the scapegoat for everything wrong with French society. She was supposed to be the bridge between Austria and France, but instead she became the lightning rod for French resentment. And here's the kicker. None of this was her choice. She was 14, for crying out loud. Most 14-year-olds today can't choose what to have for lunch without a minor existential crisis. But Marie Antoinette was expected to single-handedly maintain international diplomatic relations while learning to navigate one of the most treacherous royal courts in Europe. The wedding contract was signed in 1769, when she was still just 13. Let that marinate for a moment. At 13, she was already promised to a stranger. her entire future mapped out by people who viewed her as a valuable commodity rather than a human being. But Maria Theresa wasn't sending her daughter into this blind. She hired the best tutors money could buy, drilling Marie Antoinette in French language, customs, and court etiquette. The girl had to learn not just how to speak French, but how to be French. She had to abandon her Austrian identity like changing clothes, which is exactly as emotionally healthy as it sounds. The transformation process was intense. Marie Antoinette had to learn French dances, French fashion, French table manners, and even French religious customs. She was essentially being programmed to become someone else entirely. It's like witness protection, except instead of hiding from criminals, you're hiding from your own nationality. May 7, 1770. Picture the most awkward customs checkpoint in human history. Except instead of declaring souvenirs, a 14-year-old girl is declaring her entire identity. The handover ceremony at the Rhine River was peak 18th century bureaucratic theatre. They literally built a temporary wooden pavilion on a small island in the middle of the river, neutral territory, where Marie Antoinette would officially stop being Austrian and become French. It's like a very expensive, very political changing room. The ceremony was called the remise, and it was exactly as dramatic as it sounds. Marie Antoinette had to strip completely naked, and I mean completely, because she couldn't bring a single Austrian thing into France. Not her clothes, not her jewelry, not even her underwear. Everything had to be French, down to her stockings. Imagine being 14 and having to get naked in front of complete strangers because of international politics. The trauma alone would require years of therapy that wouldn't be invented for another 2 centuries. They had French ladies-in-waiting ready with an entirely new wardrobe, but here's the thing. The clothes didn't fit properly. Because of course they didn't. Nothing about this transition was going to be comfortable. The French had essentially guessed at her measurements, which is exactly as awkward as you'd expect. But the clothing change was symbolic of something much deeper. Marie Antoinette wasn't just changing clothes. She was being forced to abandon everything that made her her. Her Austrian accent, her Austrian mannerisms, her Austrian way of thinking, all of it had to go. She was being systematically erased and rebuilt as a French political asset. The French delegation was led by the Comte de Noailles, a man so obsessed with protocol that he probably had nightmares about people using the wrong fork. He examined Marie Antoinette like she was a racehorse being delivered to new owners, checking that she matched the description in the marriage contract. Height, hair color, general health. It was all documented and verified. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette was trying to process the fact that she would never see her mother again. Think about that for a second. At 14, she was saying goodbye to her family forever. No phone calls, no video chats, no quick visits home for Christmas. Once she crossed that river, she was French property. The Austrian delegation, led by Prince Starhemberg, was equally formal but clearly emotional. These were people who had watched Marie Antoinette grow up, and they were handing her over to what might as well have been aliens. The cultural gap between Austria and France was enormous, and everyone knew it. But here's where it gets really interesting. Marie Antoinette handled it all with remarkable grace. Witnesses described her as calm, dignified, and even cheerful during the ceremony. Either she was an incredible actress, or she genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of what was happening to her. Probably both. The symbolic transformation was completed with the signing of documents that officially transferred ownership. And let's be honest, that's what it was. From Austria to France. Marie Antoinette signed her name for the last time as an Austrian archduchess, and then immediately signed again as the Dauphine of France. Then came the journey to Versailles, which was like a medieval victory parade, except the prize was a confused teenager. Every town along the route had prepared celebrations, speeches, and ceremonies. Marie Antoinette had to smile and wave while internally processing the fact that she was now public property. The French crowds were curious but reserved. They wanted to see what Austria had sent them, but they weren't exactly rolling out the red carpet with genuine enthusiasm. There was a distinct prove-yourself-worthy vibe, which is a lot of pressure for someone who still needed help lacing up her corset. What's particularly cruel is that Marie Antoinette was genuinely excited about her new life. She'd been raised on fairy tales about becoming a queen, and she thought this was her happily ever after beginning. She had no idea she was walking into a political minefield where every smile would be analyzed, every word scrutinized, and every fashion choice turned into a national incident. The journey took several days, with stops at various noble estates along the way. Each stop was another performance, another test, another opportunity to make or break first impressions. And Marie Antoinette, bless her naive heart, thought these people actually liked her. She wrote letters to her mother describing the wonderful reception she was receiving, completely missing the undercurrents of skepticism and calculation. It's heartbreaking, really. She was so desperate to succeed, so eager to please, that she couldn't see the political machinery grinding around her. The closer they got to Versailles, the more elaborate the ceremonies became. By the time they reached the outskirts of Paris, Marie Antoinette had been transformed from a person into a symbol. She was no longer Marie Antonia from Austria. She was the Dauphine of France, a living, breathing representation of the alliance between two great tents. But symbols, as history would repeatedly demonstrate, are fragile things. They can be worshipped one day and destroyed the next. And Marie Antoinette, in all her 14-year-old innocence, had no idea she'd just become the most vulnerable symbol in Europe. The irony was already setting in. She'd been sent to France to symbolize peace and unity, that her very presence reminded everyone of France's complicated relationship with Austria. She was simultaneously the solution to the problem, and the problem itself. If you think your workplace has complicated politics, wait until you hear about Versailles. Imagine the world's most expensive office building, filled with the world's most entitled co-workers, where the dress code costs more than a house, and your job performance is literally a matter of life and death. Welcome to Marie Antoinette's new home. Versailles in 1770 was like a small city dedicated entirely to the worship of one man, King Louis XV. Everything revolved around his schedule, his preferences, his moods. The palace housed roughly 10,000 people at any given time, nobles, servants, hangers-on, and various parasites, who had figured out how to turn royal proximity into profit. The building itself was a monument to excess that would make modern billionaires blush. Louis XIV had essentially taken a hunting lodge and transformed it into the most expensive piece of real estate in human history. Gold leaf everywhere, mirrors imported at astronomical cost, gardens that required armies of gardeners to maintain. It was conspicuous consumption turned into architectural form. But here's what's truly insane. Despite all this luxury, the palace was actually pretty uncomfortable to live in. The heating was terrible, the plumbing was medieval, and privacy was virtually non-existent. You could have a room filled with priceless art and still freeze to death in winter. It's like living in a beautiful museum where the exhibits include you. Marie Antoinette's first impression of Versailles was probably similar to Dorothy's first glimpse of Oz: overwhelming, colorful, and vaguely threatening. Everything was bigger, brighter, and more complicated than anything she'd experienced in Austria. The Habsburg court was formal, sure, but Versailles was formal with a French twist, which meant it was both more elaborate and somehow more petty at the same time. The etiquette at Versailles wasn't just complex, it was weaponized. Every gesture had meaning, every position had significance, every slight was intentional. The simple act of putting on the Queen's chemise, for example, involved a hierarchy so complicated it required a flowchart. The highest-ranking lady present had the honor, but if a lady of higher rank arrived mid-dressing, the chemise had to be passed to her, regardless of how inconvenient this was for the poor queen standing there half-naked. Imagine trying to get dressed while playing an elaborate game of social chess. Marie Antoinette, coming from the relatively straightforward Austrian court, must have felt like she'd enrolled in advanced calculus when she was still learning basic math. The French court operated on a system of favor and access that was more complex than any modern corporate hierarchy. Your physical proximity to the king during various ceremonies determined your social status, your political influence, and ultimately your financial survival. People spent fortunes just to secure the right to watch the king eat breakfast. Marie Antoinette's introduction to this system was through her new apartments, which were simultaneously luxurious and restrictive. Yes, they were filled with priceless furniture and art, but they were also essentially a very expensive prison. Every room had multiple entrances, which meant privacy was impossible. Servants, courtiers, and random nobles could appear at any moment, and refusing them entry was a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. The daily routine at Versailles was like performance art meets bureaucracy. Marie Antoinette had to learn not just what to do, but when to do it, how to do it, and with whom she was allowed to do it. The morning laver, getting dressed ceremony, alone involved dozens of people, each with specific roles and privileges. It was like having a flash mob help you get ready for work, except the flash mob was made up of some of the most powerful people in Europe. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Versailles life was the complete lack of genuine human connection. Everyone wanted something from you. Everyone was watching you, and everyone was reporting back to someone else about your behavior. Marie Antoinette was surrounded by people constantly, yet she was essentially alone. The language barrier didn't help. Marie Antoinette's French was decent but not perfect, and the French court had its own dialect filled with subtle implications and coded meanings. Imagine trying to navigate office politics in a second language where every wrong word choice could spark an international incident. The food situation was particularly absurd. Meals at Versailles were public spectacles where the royal family ate while crowds of nobles watched. It's like having dinner in a fishbowl, except the fish are judging your table manners and taking notes for their memoirs. Marie Antoinette had to learn to eat gracefully while being stared at by dozens of people, some of whom were hoping she'd choke. The fashion pressure was intense. Marie Antoinette had to look perfect at all times because her appearance was a reflection of French royal dignity, but perfect according to French standards was different from Austrian standards, and the fashion rules changed constantly. It was like playing a video game where the rules are updated daily and failure means public humiliation. What made this all more surreal was that Marie Antoinette was still essentially a child trying to navigate this adult world of political intrigue and social manipulation. She was expected to be sophisticated enough to handle complex diplomatic situations while still being young enough to be considered innocent and charming. It's an impossible balance that would have challenged someone twice her age. The Austrian ambassadors tried to help, but their assistance came with its own complications. Every conversation with them was monitored by the French court, which meant Marie Antoinette couldn't even seek comfort from her countrymen without it becoming a political statement. And through it all, she hadn't even met her future husband yet. All this elaborate preparation, all this stress and adjustment, was leading up to marrying a complete stranger who, by all accounts, was about as socially awkward as she was inexperienced. The stage was set for what should have been a fairy tale romance, but was shaping up to be more like a very expensive arranged business merger between two emotionally unprepared teenagers. May 16, 1770. The most expensive wedding in human history was about to take place, and the groom was reportedly more interested in the lock mechanisms in the chapel doors than the bride walking down the aisle. The wedding of Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste wasn't just a ceremony. It was France showing off to Europe like a peacock having an identity crisis. The budget was so astronomical that the exact figures were kept secret to avoid public riots. When your wedding budget could fund a small war, perhaps it's time to reconsider your priorities. But let's talk about the couple first, because this is where the story gets truly tragic in its comedy. Marie Antoinette had finally met her future husband a few days earlier, and the encounter was awkward. Louis Auguste was 15, painfully shy, and had all the romantic charisma of a very well-dressed doorstop. He was more comfortable discussing the finer points of metallurgy than making small talk with his beautiful bride-to-be. Marie Antoinette, for her part, was trying her absolute best to be charming and interested, but you could practically see her internally recalibrating her expectations. This wasn't the dashing prince from her childhood fantasies. This was a teenage boy who got genuinely excited about locksmithing techniques and seemed to view their upcoming marriage as another diplomatic obligation to endure. The physical contrast was almost cruel. Marie Antoinette was radiant, graceful, and naturally charismatic. Louis Auguste was not. He was heavy-set, awkward in his movements, and had the social skills of someone who'd been raised by very polite wolves. It's like pairing a swan with a particularly well-educated penguin. But the show must go on. And what a show it was. The chapel at Versailles was decorated like someone had challenged a team of interior designers to use every expensive material known to humanity: gold, silver, precious stones, rare fabrics. It was like walking into a jewelry box designed by someone with unlimited funds and questionable taste. The guest list read like a who's who of European nobility, plus various hangers-on who had somehow secured invitations to the social event of the decade. Everyone who was anyone was there, along with everyone who wanted to be someone and had the connections to make it happen. Marie Antoinette's wedding dress was a masterpiece of excess that took months to create. The fabric alone cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and that was before adding the embroidery, the jewels, and the various accessories that were required by court protocol. She looked absolutely stunning, which only emphasized how mismatched the couple appeared. The ceremony itself was conducted with the kind of religious pomp that makes modern megachurch productions look understated. Every prayer, every blessing, every ritual gesture was performed with elaborate precision, while hundreds of nobles watched and judged. It was like getting married in a cathedral-sized theatre where everyone in the audience had opinions about your life choices. Louis Auguste, bless his heart, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ornate flooring. This was a young man who found comfort in solitude and mechanical precision, not public spectacle and emotional display. He went through the motions competently enough, but you could practically see him mentally calculating the exact moment when he could escape to his workshop. Marie Antoinette handled it all with the grace that would become her trademark, but there were moments when her smile seemed slightly strained. She was performing happiness while privately processing the reality of her situation. This wasn't the romantic beginning she'd dreamed of. This was a very public business transaction, wrapped in religious ceremony. The reception that followed was even more extravagant than the wedding itself. The banquet featured dozens of courses, each more elaborate than the last. There were dishes from across the French Empire, wines that had been aging since before Marie Antoinette was born, and desserts that were architectural marvels in sugar form. But here's the truly insane part. Most of the guests didn't actually get to eat any of it. The seating arrangements were so hierarchically complex that half the nobles spent the entire reception standing around watching other people eat, while trying to look like this was exactly how they preferred to spend their evening. The dancing was another exercise in choreographed social warfare. Every dance had political implications. Every partner choice sent messages, and every misstep was noted by observers who would be gossiping about it for months. Marie Antoinette, who was an accomplished dancer, navigated this minefield with skill, but you could see her gradually realizing that even recreational activities were now political statements. The wedding gifts were a study in competitive generosity. European royalty tried to outdo each other with presents so elaborate they required their own transportation and storage facilities. Jewelry collections, art pieces, exotic animals, entire libraries. It was like Christmas morning for someone with unlimited storage space and no concept of practicality. The most expensive gift was also the most symbolic. A necklace from her mother that contained diamonds worth more than most kingdoms' annual budgets. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was also a chain, a gorgeous, glittering reminder of the expectations and obligations that now bound her to her new role. As the evening wound down, Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste faced the traditional bedding ceremony, which was exactly as mortifying as it sounds. Court protocol required witnesses to the consummation, because apparently even the most intimate moments of royal marriage were considered public business. The whole spectacle cost enough money to feed thousands of families for years, all to celebrate the union of two teenagers who barely knew each other and seemed to have nothing in common except their shared royal bloodlines. It was magnificent and tragic, beautiful and absurd, basically a perfect metaphor for everything that was wrong with the French monarchy. But the real tragedy wasn't the money spent or even the awkward couple dynamic. It was that this wedding, meant to symbolize hope and unity, was actually the beginning of a story that would end with both bride and groom losing their heads, literally. Let's talk about the elephant in the opulent room. Or rather, the elephant not in the opulent room. Because for 7 years, Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste had what might charitably be called the most expensive roommate situation in European history. The marriage wasn't consummated for 7 years. 7 years. In a time when royal marriages were basically breeding contracts with crowns attached. This was scandalous beyond belief. Imagine explaining to your in-laws that you've been married for nearly a decade but still haven't figured out the basic mechanics of producing an heir. The problem, as delicately documented by various court physicians and gossiping nobles, was primarily Louis Auguste's. Without getting too clinical, let's just say he had a physical condition that made marital intimacy challenging. It was correctable with a minor surgical procedure, but Louis Auguste was terrified of surgery. Given that 18th century medicine had all the precision of a blindfolded dart game, his reluctance was understandable. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette was stuck in the world's most awkward waiting game. She was a teenager with normal human desires, married to a man who treated their shared bedroom like a very fancy library, where they occasionally slept in the same vicinity. The poor girl didn't even understand what was wrong. She just knew that her husband seemed more interested in reading about lock mechanisms than in any mechanisms related to her. The court gossip was brutal. in Versailles, where everyone's business was everyone else's entertainment. A non-consummated royal marriage was like a soap opera that everyone could participate in. Nobles would literally place bets on when the Dauphin and Dauphine would finally produce an heir. It was the ultimate reality show before reality shows existed. Marie Antoinette's letters to her mother during this period are heartbreaking in their confusion and desperation. She couldn't explicitly discuss the problem. Royal correspondence was essentially public property, but you can read between the lines of her increasingly frantic updates about court life and fashion. She was slowly realizing that her fairy tale marriage was more like a very comfortable prison sentence. The pressure from both Austria and France was immense. Marie Antoinette's entire purpose, from a political perspective, was to produce French heirs with Austrian blood. If she couldn't do that, she was essentially a very expensive diplomatic failure. Her mother, Maria Theresa, sent increasingly pointed letters about the importance of fulfilling her duties, which must have been about as helpful as they sound. Louis Auguste, meanwhile, was dealing with his own psychological minefield. He was naturally shy and introverted, and the constant pressure to perform, literally and figuratively, only made him retreat further into his hobbies. He threw himself into locksmithing, hunting, and reading with the intensity of someone trying to avoid thinking about their problems. The couple developed what we might now call a friendship, but it was a friendship trapped inside a marriage contract that neither of them had chosen. They were genuinely fond of each other in a brotherly sisterly way, which would have been sweet if they weren't supposed to be producing the next generation of French royalty. Marie Antoinette began to compensate for her unfulfilled marriage by throwing herself into court life with increasing intensity. She became the center of a social whirlwind, hosting parties, setting fashion trends, and generally becoming the most visible member of the royal family. If she couldn't be a successful wife in private, she'd be a spectacular dauphine in public. This is when the gambling started. Marie Antoinette discovered card games, and she was both naturally talented and naturally reckless. The amounts she won and lost became legendary. We're talking sums that could buy estates, but gambling gave her something her marriage couldn't: excitement, risk, and the possibility of genuine triumph or failure, based on her own choices, rather than diplomatic necessity. The fashion escalation also began during this period. If you can't express yourself through intimate partnership, why not express yourself through increasingly elaborate clothing? Marie Antoinette's dress budget became astronomical, as she commissioned gowns that were essentially wearable art pieces. Each outfit was more extravagant than the last, as if she were trying to make herself so visually spectacular that people would forget about her personal failures. But perhaps the most telling development was her growing circle of friends, or what passed for friends in the artificial environment of Versailles. These were relationships built on shared interests in fashion, gossip, and entertainment rather than political advantage, which made them both more genuine and more dangerous. Marie Antoinette was creating her own social world within the rigid structure of court life. The Comte d'Artois, her brother-in-law, became a particular favorite. He was everything Louis Auguste wasn't: charming, witty, socially confident, and very much interested in the kind of adult relationships that Marie Antoinette was missing in her own marriage. Their friendship was innocent enough, but it provided dangerous fuel for court gossips, who were already looking for ways to criticize the Austrian princess. The Austrian ambassador, Mercy, was sending increasingly worried reports back to Vienna about Marie Antoinette's behavior. She was becoming too French, too independent, too willing to prioritize her own happiness over diplomatic protocol. From Austria's perspective, she was supposed to be a political asset, not a young woman trying to figure out her own identity. The irony was beautiful in its cruelty. Marie Antoinette was failing as a wife, precisely because she was succeeding as a person. She was developing her own interests, her own friendships, her own sense of style and preference, but those very qualities that made her an interesting individual made her a problematic royal spouse. And through it all, Louis Auguste continued to tinker with his locks, hunt his deer, and avoid the increasingly obvious problem that was slowly but surely undermining the legitimacy of their entire marriage. They were living parallel lives in the same palace, each retreating into their own coping mechanisms while the court and the country watched and waited for them to figure out how to be married. By 1774, Marie Antoinette had acquired a nickname that would follow her to the grave: l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. In French court circles, calling someone the Austrian was like calling them that foreign troublemaker who doesn't understand how things work here. except with more political implications and better hair. The transformation from beloved Dauphine to controversial foreign influence happened gradually, then suddenly. Marie Antoinette had committed the ultimate court crime. She'd stopped trying to be invisible. Instead of quietly blending into the background while waiting for her husband to figure out basic human biology, she'd become the most interesting person at Versailles. And in a court where interesting people were inherently threatening people, this was a problem. The gambling was getting out of hand. Marie Antoinette's card games weren't just entertainment. They were financial spectacles that made medieval jousting tournaments look like penny poker. She'd win or lose amounts that could fund small armies, and she'd do it with the kind of reckless charm that made people simultaneously admire and resent her. When you're casually betting more money than most people see in a lifetime, you're bound to make enemies among those who can't afford to play at your level. But the real issue wasn't the money, it was the independence. Marie Antoinette was making her own choices about how to spend her time, who to befriend, and what to care about. In a world where royal women were supposed to be beautiful, fertile, and politically invisible, this was revolutionary behavior, and revolutions, even personal ones, make people nervous. The fashion situation had escalated beyond extravagant into genuinely shocking territory. Marie Antoinette wasn't just wearing expensive clothes. She was inventing new categories of expensive clothes. Her hairdresser, Leonard, was creating sculptures on her head that required engineering consultations. We're talking about hair arrangements so elaborate they needed structural support and advanced planning. It was architecture that you wore on your skull. The famous poof hairstyles weren't just big hair, they were themed entertainment systems. Marie Antoinette would have miniature ships built into her hair to celebrate naval victories, or tiny garden scenes to commemorate particular events. Imagine having a diorama as a hairdo. It was creative, certainly, but it was also the kind of creative that made people question your judgment and your priorities. The court was starting to split into factions. Those who found Marie Antoinette's behavior charming and refreshing, and those who found it dangerous and inappropriate. The charming camp appreciated her wit, her style, and her ability to make Versailles feel less like a museum, and more like a place where interesting things happened. The dangerous camp worried that she was undermining royal dignity with her Austrian informality, and her obvious enjoyment of attention. Then came the incident with the Comtesse de Polignac. Marie Antoinette had found herself a best friend, a genuine, close friendship that transcended political necessity. Yolande de Polignac was beautiful, charming, and most importantly, fun to be around. She made Marie Antoinette laugh, understood her references, and provided the kind of emotional support that her marriage conspicuously lacked. But friendship, in the context of Versailles, was never just friendship. Every relationship had political implications, and Marie Antoinette's obvious favoritism toward Polignac created a power structure that bypassed traditional court hierarchies. Suddenly, access to the Dauphine went through Polignac rather than through established noble families who'd been working the system for generations. The gift-giving became legendary. Marie Antoinette would shower Polignac with jewelry, money, estates, and titles with the kind of generosity that made other courtiers wonder what exactly they were getting in return. The amounts were staggering. We're talking about financial transfers that would make modern celebrity spending look restrained. Marie Antoinette was essentially funding an entire secondary court centered around her best friend. Meanwhile, the political situation in France was becoming increasingly unstable, and Marie Antoinette was becoming a convenient scapegoat for everything that was going wrong. Bad harvest? Blame the Austrian. Economic problems? Obviously the fault of that foreign princess who spends more on jewelry than most regions collect in taxes. Military setbacks? Clearly the result of Austrian influence undermining French interest. The pamphlets started during this period, crude, often pornographic publications that spread gossip and accusations about Marie Antoinette's behavior. These weren't just criticism. They were character assassination disguised as political commentary. They accused her of everything from financial corruption to sexual impropriety, often with graphic illustrations that would make modern tabloids blush. What made the attacks particularly cruel was how they twisted her genuine attempts at friendship and enjoyment into evidence of moral corruption. Her close relationship with Polignac was portrayed as lesbian affair. Her gambling was presented as deliberate economic sabotage. Her fashion choices were interpreted as contempt for French suffering. Every human impulse was reframed as political crime. The Austrian committee myth began to take hold. the idea that Marie Antoinette was secretly working with Austria to undermine French interests. Never mind that she had very little political power, and even less political knowledge. The idea that she was a foreign agent made perfect sense to Toby, who needed someone to blame for their problems. Marie Antoinette, for her part, seemed genuinely puzzled by the hostility. She was just trying to make the best of her situation, to find happiness and meaning within the constraints of her arranged life. She couldn't understand why enjoying herself was being interpreted as attacking France, or why her friendships were seen as political conspiracies. The tragedy is that she was being criticized for being human. She wanted friendship, excitement, beauty, and fun, completely normal desires that became dangerous because she was royal and foreign. Her crime wasn't political treason, it was emotional authenticity in a role that demanded political fallon. But the reputation was solidifying. By the mid-1770s, Marie Antoinette was no longer just the Austrian princess. She was the Austrian problem. And problems, in the volatile world of 18th century French politics, had a way of becoming crises when you least expected them. May 10, 1774. King Louis V died of smallpox, and suddenly Marie Antoinette found herself in the most powerful job she was completely unprepared for. At 19, she became Queen of France. Not Dauphine, not princess-in-waiting, but actual, legitimate, crown-wearing queen of the most powerful nation in Europe. The coronation of Louis XVI was a spectacle that made their wedding look like a casual dinner party. This wasn't just about crowning a new king, it was about reassuring an increasingly nervous nation that the monarchy was still divinely ordained, politically legitimate, and financially stable. Spoiler alert, it was none of those things, but the ceremony was magnificent. Marie Antoinette's transformation from Dauphine to Queen was like getting promoted to CEO of a company that's secretly bankrupt while everyone's watching to see if you'll fix it or destroy it completely. The job description included being a political symbol, a fashion icon, a diplomatic asset, and, most importantly, a baby-making machine for the continuation of the royal line. But here's the thing about becoming queen when you're 19. You still have the judgment of someone who's 19. Marie Antoinette approached her new role with enthusiasm rather than wisdom, which is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. She had ideas about how things should be done, and now she had the power to implement those ideas, regardless of whether they were good ideas. The gambling escalated immediately. As queen, Marie Antoinette's credit was essentially unlimited, and she used it like someone who just discovered online shopping with no spending limits. The card games at Versailles became legendary for their stakes and their drama. She'd win or lose fortunes with the kind of casual indifference that made witnesses question either her mathematical skills or her grip on reality. One particularly famous evening, she lost the equivalent of several million modern dollars in a single card game. When someone suggested she might want to stop playing, she reportedly laughed and said she was just getting started. It's the kind of confidence that's either inspiring or terrifying, depending on whether you're paying the bills. The fashion budget exploded. Marie Antoinette commissioned dresses that were essentially wearable art installations. We're talking about gowns that required multiple servants to put on, structural engineering to support, and small fortunes to create. Her dressmaker, Rose Bertin, became one of the most powerful people in France, purely through her access to the Queen's fashion obsessions. But the most scandalous development was the Petit Trianon. Louis XVI gave Marie Antoinette her own palace, a small retreat where she could escape the formality of Versailles. Small is relative when you're talking about royal architecture. The Petit Trianon was still large enough to house dozens of people, and beautiful enough to make other European royals deeply jealous. Marie Antoinette turned the Petit Trianon into her personal playground, a place where she could be herself rather than a royal symbol. She redecorated it according to her own taste, invited her own friends, and established her own social rules. It was like having a very expensive personal clubhouse, where membership was determined by whether the Queen found you amusing. The guest list at Petit Trianon became a source of court controversy. Marie Antoinette was inviting people based on personal preference rather than political importance, which completely upended traditional court hierarchies. Suddenly, charming minor nobles had better access to the Queen than established ducal families who'd been working the system for generations. This is when the Marie Antoinette circle became a recognized political force. The Polignac family, in particular, benefited enormously from the Queen's friendship. Yolande de Polignac and her relatives received titles, money, and positions that traditional court protocol would never have granted them. Marie Antoinette was essentially creating her own aristocracy based on personal affection, rather than hereditary right. The most infamous incident was the diamond necklace affair, which perfectly encapsulated everything that was going wrong with Marie Antoinette's reputation. A con artist named Jeanne de la Motte convinced Cardinal de Rohan that Marie Antoinette wanted to secretly purchase an incredibly expensive diamond necklace, but needed him to act as an intermediary. The necklace was worth approximately 15 million modern dollars, and was so elaborate, it looked like someone had tried to turn a jewelry store into wearable art. Rohan, desperate to regain favor with the Queen, who openly disliked him, agreed to the scheme. Lamotte pocketed the necklace and disappeared, leaving Rohan holding a massive debt and Marie Antoinette facing accusations of secret corruption. The beautiful irony: Marie Antoinette had actually refused to buy the necklace when it was legitimately offered to her, saying France had better uses for that much money. But because her reputation for extravagance was so well established, everyone assumed she must have been involved in the conspiracy. The scandal exploded across Europe. Here was a story that had everything: royal corruption, religious hypocrisy, massive fraud, and sexual intrigue. The pamphlets had a field day, creating increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories about what the Queen really knew, and when she knew it. Marie Antoinette was completely innocent of the actual crime, but she was guilty of creating the reputation that made the crime believable. Her years of extravagant spending and questionable friendships had established her as someone who might very well engage in secret financial schemes to fund her lifestyle. The legal proceedings were a disaster for the monarchy. When the case went to court, public opinion was firmly against Marie Antoinette, even though the evidence clearly showed her innocence. The French people wanted to believe their queen was corrupt, because it confirmed everything they already suspected about royal excess and foreign influence. Cardinal de Rohan was acquitted, which was legally correct but politically catastrophic. If he was innocent of knowing wrongdoing, it implied that he genuinely believed the Queen would engage in secret financial conspiracies. Either Marie Antoinette was guilty, or her reputation was so bad that elaborate fraud schemes seemed plausible. Neither option was good for royal credibility. The affair marked a turning point in Marie Antoinette's public image. She went from being seen as extravagant but harmless, to being viewed as potentially dangerous and definitely untrustworthy. The Austrian princess had become the Austrian threat. December 1978. After 8 years of marriage, Marie Antoinette finally gave birth to her first child, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. The relief at Versailles was palpable. The Queen had proven she could produce heirs, which meant the dynasty was secure and the political pressure could finally ease. Except, of course, it was a girl. In 18th century royal politics, daughters were lovely accessories, but sons were necessities. Marie Antoinette had done half the job. She'd proven her fertility, but she still needed to produce a male heir to truly secure her position. It's like passing the midterm, but still needing to ace the final exam to avoid failing the class. The birth itself was a public spectacle that would horrify any modern parent. Royal births were community events where dozens of courtiers crowded into the delivery room to witness the miracle of royal reproduction. Marie Antoinette gave birth while surrounded by people who were essentially there for the entertainment value. Privacy during childbirth is apparently a modern luxury, but motherhood changed Marie Antoinette in ways that were both touching and politically dangerous. She became genuinely devoted to her daughter, spending time with her in ways that were considered unusual for royal mothers. Typically, royal children were immediately handed over to nurses and governesses, appearing for scheduled visits like tiny diplomats with their own social secretaries. Marie Antoinette insisted on being involved in her daughter's daily care, which sounds sweet until you realize how this looked to critics who were already questioning her priorities. Here was a queen spending time on maternal activities when she should have been focused on political responsibilities. Every tender moment with her child was reframed as evidence of her failure to understand her role. The political situation in France was deteriorating rapidly, and Marie Antoinette was becoming an increasingly convenient scapegoat. The country was essentially bankrupt. Centuries of expensive wars and poor financial management had created a fiscal crisis that would have challenged the most competent leadership. But instead of addressing systemic problems, it was easier to blame the Austrian queen, who spent fortunes on dresses. The American Revolution was draining French resources while providing very little obvious benefit to French citizens. France was funding American independence primarily to spite Britain, which is exactly as expensive and strategically questionable as it sounds. But when people needed someone to blame for the mounting costs, Marie Antoinette's Austrian origins made her a perfect target. The let them eat cake story probably originated during this period, although Marie Antoinette never actually said it. The quote is attributed to an anonymous princess, who supposedly responded to news of bread shortages by suggesting that hungry people eat brioche instead. It's almost certainly apocryphal, but it perfectly captured how people viewed Marie Antoinette's perceived disconnect from common suffering. The real tragedy is that Marie Antoinette was actually becoming more politically aware as the situation worsened. She was reading policy papers, attending council meetings, and trying to understand the complex financial and social problems facing France. But her reputation for frivolity was so well established that her attempts at serious political engagement were interpreted as foreign interference. October 22, 1781, Marie Antoinette gave birth to Louis Joseph, the long-awaited Dauphin. The celebration was extraordinary. Cannons fired, bells rang, and the entire country officially rejoiced. Finally, the Austrian queen had produced a French heir, the succession was secure, the political pressure was relieved, and Marie Antoinette could focus on being a mother rather than a baby-making machine. Except the baby was sickly from birth. Louis Joseph had what was probably tuberculosis of the spine, a condition that caused him constant pain and made his survival uncertain. Marie Antoinette threw herself into caring for him with the intensity of someone who'd waited years to become a mother and now faced losing her precious son. The royal nursery became Marie Antoinette's primary focus, which was both understandable and politically disastrous. She spent hours with her children, playing with them, reading to them, and generally behaving like a devoted mother rather than a symbolic queen. Every moment of maternal attention was time not spent on court politics, diplomatic receptions, or the public appearances that maintained royal visibility. Her critics had a field day with this. Here was evidence that Marie Antoinette prioritized her personal happiness over her political responsibilities. She was being selfish by caring for her own children, instead of focusing on the symbolic needs of the French people. Motherhood, which should have been her greatest triumph, became another source of political vulnerability. The financial crisis deepened, and Marie Antoinette's spending became an increasingly sensitive political issue. Every dress, every piece of jewelry, every renovation at the Petit Trianon was scrutinized as evidence of royal indifference to national suffering. The pamphlets became more vicious, portraying her as a foreign parasite draining French resources while French people struggled to buy bread. What made the attacks particularly cruel was how they twisted her maternal devotion into evidence of political corruption. Her love for her children was presented as proof that she cared more about her Austrian family than about France. Her attempts to protect her sickly son from court protocol were interpreted as foreign influence undermining French traditions. The Assembly of Notables convened in 1787 to address the financial crisis, and Marie Antoinette found herself at the center of political debates she barely understood. Suddenly, her spending habits weren't just personal choices. They were political symbols representing everything wrong with the monarchy. Every expensive decision she'd made was being retroactively reframed as evidence of systemic royal corruption. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was how her children became political pawns in disputes they couldn't understand. Little Louis Joseph, already suffering from his illness, was now also a symbol of dynastic continuity in an increasingly unstable political situation. Marie-Thérèse, just a child, was already being analyzed for evidence of Austrian influence in her education and behavior. Marie Antoinette was discovering that being a royal mother was like being a regular mother. Except every parenting decision was a political statement. Every moment of affection was public property, and every attempt to protect your children was interpreted as a threat to national interests. She'd finally achieved the happiness she'd been seeking. She had children she adored, and a family life that gave her genuine joy. But that happiness was becoming politically dangerous in a country that increasingly saw royal joy as evidence of indifference to national suffering. May 5, 1789. The Estates General convened for the first time since 1614, and Marie Antoinette attended the opening ceremony wearing a dress that cost more than most people earned in several lifetimes. It was perhaps the most tone-deaf fashion choice in political history, like wearing a diamond tiara to a bankruptcy hearing. But here's the thing about revolutions. They don't start suddenly, they build slowly, like pressure in a kettle, until something finally makes the whole system explode. Marie Antoinette had been living inside that kettle for years without realizing the temperature was rising. To her, this was just another political ceremony, with elaborate costumes and formal speeches. The Third Estate's transformation into the National Assembly was like watching a very polite coup unfold in real time. These weren't radical revolutionaries storming the palace. They were lawyers and merchants and middle-class professionals who'd simply decided they were done asking permission to fix France's problems. They were going to fix them with or without royal approval. Marie Antoinette's initial response to the political upheaval was, well, it was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent 20 years learning that political problems were things other people handled. She continued hosting parties, commissioning dresses and planning entertainment as if the growing revolutionary sentiment was just another court faction that would eventually sort itself out. The irony was beautiful in its tragedy. Marie Antoinette had spent years being criticized for political ignorance, and now that France desperately needed political wisdom, she was still politically ignorant. She'd learned to navigate court intrigue, but court intrigue was nothing like actual revolution. It's like being a master chess player, suddenly finding yourself in a street fight. June 20, 1789. The tennis court oath. Members of the Third Estate gathered in an indoor tennis court and swore they wouldn't disband until France had a new constitution. Marie Antoinette's response was to order new furniture for the Petite Triana. The revolutionaries were literally rewriting the foundations of French government, and the Queen was redecorating. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because Marie Antoinette wasn't actually as clueless as her critics claimed. She was reading the political pamphlets, listening to the debates, and gradually understanding that this wasn't just another political squabble. The problem was that understanding the revolution and knowing how to respond to it were entirely different skills. Her letters during this period show someone who was genuinely trying to comprehend what was happening to her country and her family. She wasn't the vapid, uncaring foreigner of revolutionary propaganda. She was a woman watching her world collapse while feeling completely powerless to stop it. But her attempts to engage politically were filtered through years of established reputation and Austrian suspicion. July 14, 1789. The storming of the Bastille. While Parisians were literally tearing apart a royal fortress with their bare hands, Marie Antoinette was at Versailles, probably discussing hair arrangements with her stylist. The disconnect between revolutionary reality and royal routine was becoming surreal. It was like living in two different centuries simultaneously. The news of the Bastille reached Versailles that evening, and Marie Antoinette's first concern was reportedly whether this would affect the next day's planned entertainment. This wasn't callousness, it was psychological defense mechanism. When your entire world is being systematically destroyed, sometimes you focus on the small, controllable details to avoid confronting the massive, uncontrollable catastrophe. But the revolution was coming for her personally, not just politically. The pamphlets were becoming more vicious, more sexually explicit, and more focused on Marie Antoinette as the symbol of everything wrong with royal rule. She wasn't just criticized, she was dehumanized, transformed into a cartoon villain who represented foreign corruption and aristocratic excess. The October days were perhaps the most terrifying experience of Marie Antoinette's life up to that point. Thousands of angry Parisians, mostly women, marched to Versailles, demanding bread and royal accountability. These weren't abstract political protesters. They were desperate people who blamed the Queen personally for their suffering. Marie Antoinette found herself face to face with revolutionary hatred in a way that court life had never prepared her for. These people wanted her blood. Literally. They weren't interested in political compromise or diplomatic solutions. They wanted the Austrian bitch to pay for France's problems with her life. The royal family was forced to return to Paris, essentially as prisoners of the revolution. The journey from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace was like a funeral procession, except the corpse was still alive and watching her own political death unfold. Marie Antoinette was leaving behind everything that had defined her identity. The palace, the court, the elaborate social structure that had given her life meaning. The Tuileries was technically a palace, but it felt like a very elegant prison. The royal family was under constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their communications monitored. Marie Antoinette went from being the most powerful woman in France to being the most famous prisoner in France in the space of a few months. What's particularly cruel is how the revolution stripped away all the things that had made Marie Antoinette's difficult life bearable. No more gambling, no more elaborate parties, no more fashion experiments. No more close friendships with people who made her laugh. She was reduced to the basic elements of her identity: wife, mother, and political symbol. The children were suffering too. Little Louis Joseph's health was deteriorating, and the stress of the political situation was making everything worse. Marie Antoinette was watching her son die while simultaneously trying to protect him from the hatred directed at their family. The maternal devotion that had once been criticized as political weakness now became her primary source of strength. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was how the revolution reframed every choice she'd ever made. Every dress, every party, every friendship, every moment of happiness was now evidence in the case against royal legitimacy. Her entire adult life was being prosecuted as a crime against the French people. Marie Antoinette was learning that in revolutionary times, being human is a political act. Every emotion, every relationship, every attempt to find meaning and joy in your circumstances becomes a statement about your loyalty to the new order. And when you're the symbol of the old order, humanity itself becomes a form of treason. June 4, 1791, 11:30 p.m. Picture this: the Queen of France, disguised as a governess, sneaking through the corridors of the Tuileries Palace, with fake papers and a head full of desperate hope. Marie Antoinette was about to attempt the most important performance of her life, and she'd chosen to dress for the role of someone who definitely wasn't Marie Antoinette. The escape plan was months in the making and involved more moving parts than a Swiss clockwork mechanism. The royal family would slip out of Paris under cover of darkness, travel to the fortress town of Montmy near the Austrian border, and rally loyal troops for a counter-revolution. It was ambitious, complex, and required the kind of precise timing that the French royal family had never demonstrated in any other area of their lives. The mastermind behind the operation was Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman who was either Marie Antoinette's devoted friend or her secret lover, depending on which historian you ask and how much romantic drama you prefer in your political scandals. Fersen had been planning this escape with the dedication of someone whose life also depended on its success. The preparations were elaborate, and, in hindsight, completely insane. They commissioned a special carriage that was basically a mobile palace, large enough to accommodate the entire royal family, plus servants, equipped with every comfort imaginable, and about as inconspicuous as a disco ball at a funeral. When your escape vehicle needs its own engineering team, you might be overthinking the subtle part of subterfuge. The disguises were, well, they were attempts. Louis XVI was supposed to be a valet, which required him to pretend to be someone whose job involved actual work. Marie Antoinette was the governess, a role that required her to look like someone who'd never owned a diamond. The children were traveling as the offspring of a wealthy merchant family, which was probably the most believable part of the entire charade. The night of the escape, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, starting with Marie Antoinette's complete inability to look like anyone other than Marie Antoinette. Even with a simple dress and no jewelry, she radiated the kind of regal bearing that comes from 20 years of being treated like a living goddess. It's hard to blend in when you've spent your entire adult life standing out. They were supposed to leave at midnight, but didn't actually depart until after 2 a.m., because court protocol, even in the middle of a secret escape, apparently still mattered. Marie Antoinette insisted on bringing various personal items that were either sentimentally important or politically incriminating, depending on your perspective. When you're fleeing for your life, perhaps it's not the time to pack your jewelry collection. The carriage was so heavy and elaborate that it could only travel at walking speed, which defeated the entire purpose of having a carriage in the first place. They were basically conducting a high-speed chase at the pace of a leisurely stroll. Every hour they were on the road increased their chances of being recognized, and they were moving so slowly that recognition was becoming inevitable. At Sainte-Menehould, a postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet recognized Louis XV's profile from the new revolutionary currency. Here's a man whose face was literally on the money, trying to travel incognito through a country where his image was circulating in everyone's pocket. It's like a celebrity trying to go unrecognized at their own fan convention. Drouet organized a pursuit that had all the drama of a historical chase scene, except instead of horses and swords, it involved bureaucrats and paperwork. The local authorities were summoned, documents were examined, and the royal family found themselves under arrest in the town of Varennes, just 30 miles from the Austrian border and safety. The return journey to Paris was a masterpiece of public humiliation. The royal family was escorted back to the capital by hostile crowds, who treated their recapture like a victory parade. Marie Antoinette, who had spent her entire life being celebrated and admired, now experienced the unique horror of being publicly hated by thousands of people who saw her not as a person but as a symbol of oppression. The political consequences of the failed escape were catastrophic. The royal family had essentially confirmed every suspicion about their loyalty to France and their connection to foreign powers. Marie Antoinette, in particular, was now seen as definitive proof of the Austrian committee conspiracy theories. Her attempt to flee to the Austrian border was interpreted as evidence that she'd been working against French interests all along. But here's what's truly heartbreaking about the Varennes incident. It represented Marie Antoinette's last genuine attempt to control her own destiny. For 20 years, she'd been a passenger in her own life. Carried along by political currents and diplomatic necessities, the escape plan was her effort to finally make a choice about her future, even if it was a choice to run away. The failure wasn't just political, it was personal. Marie Antoinette had finally acted decisively, had finally tried to save her family and herself, and it had ended in disaster. The woman who'd been criticized for political passivity was now being punished for political action. She couldn't win because the game itself was rigged against her survival. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The royal family was placed under even stricter surveillance, their movements further restricted, their communications more heavily monitored. The Tuileries went from feeling like a palace prison to feeling like a death row holding cell. Every day brought new evidence that the revolution was moving beyond political reform towards something much more final. Marie Antoinette's letters after Varennes show someone who'd finally understood the true scope of her situation. This wasn't about political compromise or negotiated settlements anymore. This was about survival in the most basic sense. The Austrian princess had become the Austrian enemy, and enemies of the revolution were not being offered comfortable exile packages. The escape attempt had lasted less than 24 hours, but its consequences would last until Marie Antoinette's death. In trying to save herself, she'd confirmed every accusation against her. In attempting to preserve her family, she'd guaranteed their destruction. It was perhaps the most expensive travel experience in human history. The price was everything she had left to lose, but at least she'd tried. For one night, Marie Antoinette had been the author of her own story rather than a character in someone else's political drama. The story had a terrible ending, but it was finally, tragically, her own. January 21, 1793, 10:22 a.m. The sound that changed everything wasn't a gunshot or an explosion. It was the whistle of a falling blade and the roar of a crowd that had just watched their king die. Marie Antoinette was now the widow Capet, though she probably would have preferred her old title of most hated woman in France, because at least that implied she was still alive. The execution of Louis XV was revolutionary theatre at its most brutal and efficient. The guillotine, that marvel of Enlightenment engineering, had delivered its most important performance yet. The device designed to provide humane, egalitarian death, because even executions should reflect democratic values, had just definitively ended the divine right of kings in France. Marie Antoinette learned of her husband's death while imprisoned in the Temple Tower, and her reaction was everything you'd expect from someone whose entire world had just been redefined by widowhood and terror. She didn't just lose her husband, she lost her last connection to legitimate political power, her children's inheritance, and any remaining hope that this revolutionary nightmare might somehow resolve itself peacefully. But here's what's remarkable about Marie Antoinette's response to becoming a widow. She finally found her dignity. After 20 years of being criticized for frivolity, superficiality, and political ignorance, the prospect of imminent death seems to have clarified her priorities wonderfully. When you know you're going to die, apparently, it becomes much easier to figure out how to live. The woman who had once obsessed over fashion details now wore simple black mourning clothes with the kind of unconscious elegance that no amount of expensive couture had ever achieved. The queen, who had been famous for elaborate hairstyles, now appeared with grey-streaked hair, pulled back simply, and somehow looked more regal than she ever had in her powdered whiz and diamond tiaras. Her children were suffering in ways that would horrify any modern parent. 8-year-old Louis Charles had been separated from the family, and was being re-educated by revolutionary authorities, who were determined to transform the little Dauphin into a good Republican citizen. They were essentially programming a child to hate his own family, which is exactly as psychologically destructive as it sounds. Marie-Thérèse, now 14, was old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to process it in any healthy way. She was watching her mother prepare for death, while simultaneously trying to maintain some sense of normal adolescent development. Imagine being a teenager whose primary concerns include your mother's upcoming execution and your brother's forced political conversion. The letters Marie Antoinette wrote during her widowhood are some of the most moving documents in French history. Gone were the superficial concerns about court gossip and fashion trends. Instead, she wrote with the clarity of someone who had finally understood what mattered and what didn't. Love for her children, forgiveness for her enemies, and acceptance of her fate. It's almost like reading the correspondence of a completely different person. But the revolution wasn't finished with her yet. The political value of a living Marie Antoinette was becoming increasingly problematic for the new government. As long as she was alive, she represented the possibility of monarchist restoration, foreign intervention, and counter-revolutionary activity. Dead, she would just be a symbol. Alive, she was a potential rally point for enemies of the Republic. The charges against her were being prepared with all the legal sophistication of a show trial designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Treason, conspiracy with foreign enemies, corruption of her children, undermining the revolution. Basically, every crime the prosecutors could think of that might justify the execution they'd already decided upon. Marie Antoinette was transferred from the Temple to the Conciergerie, which was like moving from an uncomfortable hotel to death row. The Conciergerie was where prisoners went to await execution, not where they went to await trial. The outcome was predetermined. The legal proceedings were just paperwork to make the murder seem official. Her cell in the Conciergerie was a masterpiece of revolutionary justice, small, damp, constantly monitored, and designed to break her spirit before breaking her neck. She was watched by guards 24 hours a day, denied privacy for even the most basic human needs, and subjected to the kind of psychological pressure that would be considered torture by any modern standard. But something interesting happened during those final months. Marie Antoinette became genuinely sympathetic for the first time in her adult life. Stripped of all the wealth, power, and luxury that had made her such an easy target for revolutionary hatred, she was revealed as simply a woman facing death with remarkable courage and dignity. The guards assigned to break her spirit found themselves instead developing reluctant respect for her composure. Here was someone who had every reason to despair, her husband dead, her children endangered, her own death certain. Yet she maintained a calm dignity that impressed even her captors. It's easier to hate a symbol than to hate a brave woman facing impossible circumstances. Her final letter to Madame Elisabeth, her sister-in-law, is a document that reveals the woman Marie Antoinette had become in her final months. She wrote about forgiveness, about love for France, despite everything that had happened, and about her hope that her children would grow up to be good people, rather than seeking revenge for their parents' deaths. The transformation was complete. The frivolous Austrian princess had become a dignified French widow. But the revolution had no use for dignity, and the Republic had no place for forgiveness. Marie Antoinette had finally become the person she should have been, all along, just in time to die for the crimes of the person she used to be. The irony would have been beautiful if it weren't so tragic. Marie Antoinette had spent 20 years being criticized for not understanding France, and in her final months, she demonstrated a more profound understanding of French values, courage, dignity, sacrifice, than most of her accusers ever would. But understanding France and surviving in France were, as she was about to discover, two very different things. October 14, 1793. The trial of Marie Antoinette began with all the legal sophistication of a medieval witch hunt disguised as Enlightenment jurisprudence. The Revolutionary Tribunal had already decided she was guilty. The trial was just a formality to make her execution look like justice rather than revenge. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had come to see the Austrian bitch finally get what was coming to her. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was entertainment. The audience was there for the same reason people attend horror movies, to watch something terrible happen to someone they'd been trained to hate, in the comforting knowledge that the victim deserved their fate. The prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, approached his job with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that career advancement in revolutionary France depended on how enthusiastically you could destroy enemies of the Republic. He wasn't interested in legal niceties like evidence or due process. He was conducting a political performance designed to justify a predetermined conclusion. The charges against Marie Antoinette read like a greatest hits compilation of every accusation that had ever been made against her, regardless of whether they made legal sense or had any supporting evidence: conspiracy with foreign enemies, corruption of her children, undermining French military efforts, sexual impropriety, financial corruption, Basically everything wrong with France for the past 10 years was somehow her fault. But here's what's fascinating about Marie Antoinette's performance during the trial. She was magnificent. This woman who had been criticized her entire adult life for political ignorance and superficiality suddenly displayed a mastery of legal argument and political rhetoric that impressed even her enemies. Facing death apparently concentrates the mind wonderfully. When accused of teaching her son to hope for counter-revolution, she replied that she would never teach a child to hope for something that would require the blood of Frenchmen. When charged with corresponding with foreign enemies, she pointed out that seeking help to save her family's lives was a natural human instinct, not treason. Her responses were dignified, logical, and completely irrelevant to the tribunal's purpose. The witnesses against her were a parade of servants, former courtiers, and political opportunists who understood that their own survival might depend on how effectively they could condemn the former queen. Some of their testimony was genuinely damaging. Much of it was obviously fabricated. All of it was irrelevant because the verdict had been decided before the trial began. One particularly surreal moment came when they accused her of corrupting her 8-year-old son's morals. Marie Antoinette's response was perfectly calibrated. Nature herself would shrink from such a charge against a mother. It was perhaps the most effective thing she said during the entire trial, combining maternal dignity with implicit condemnation of her accuser's cruelty. The most heartbreaking aspect of the trial was how it revealed what Marie Antoinette had become during her imprisonment. This wasn't the frivolous queen of revolutionary propaganda. This was a woman who had been refined by suffering into someone genuinely admirable. She faced her accusers with courage, dignity, and intelligence that would have served her well if she'd discovered these qualities 20 years earlier. But the tribunal wasn't interested in who Marie Antoinette had become. They were prosecuting who she had been. Every dress, every party, every friendship from her years as queen was presented as evidence of her guilt. The woman sitting in the dock was paying for the crimes of the symbol she had once represented. Her defense attorney, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, was in an impossible position. How do you defend someone when the court has already decided they're guilty and the audience wants to see them die? He did his best with legal arguments about insufficient evidence and procedural irregularities, but everyone in the courtroom understood that this trial was about politics, not law. The foreign correspondence charges were particularly damaging because they were largely true. Marie Antoinette had indeed been in contact with Austrian officials, had indeed hoped for foreign intervention to save the monarchy, and had indeed provided information about French military plans to potential enemies. The problem wasn't that she was innocent of these charges. The problem was that they were acts of desperation rather than treason. When you're watching your family face execution and your country descend into chaos, reaching out to foreign relatives for help seems like basic human survival instinct. But in revolutionary France, basic human survival instinct was being redefined as treason against the Republic. Marie Antoinette was being prosecuted for trying to save her own life. The trial lasted only 3 days, which was remarkably efficient considering they were determining the fate of someone who had been Queen of France for nearly 20 years. But efficiency was the point. The tribunal had a schedule to maintain and a political message to send. Marie Antoinette was being processed through revolutionary justice like grain through a mill. The verdict was announced on October 15, guilty on all charges, sentenced to death. The crowd erupted in celebration, as if they'd just witnessed the triumph of justice, rather than the completion of a predetermined political assassination. Marie Antoinette received the news with the same calm dignity she'd maintained throughout the trial, which probably disappointed spectators who'd been hoping for dramatic breakdown. But here's the most tragic aspect of the entire proceeding. By the time of her trial, Marie Antoinette had actually become someone worth defending. The years of suffering and loss had transformed her from a symbol of aristocratic excess into a genuinely sympathetic figure facing impossible circumstances with remarkable grace. The revolution was executing the right person at the wrong time. If they'd killed the frivolous queen of the 1780s, it would have been politically justified and emotionally satisfying. But they were killing the dignified widow of 1793, someone who had been refined by suffering into genuine nobility of character. Marie Antoinette had finally learned how to be a queen, just in time to die, as a prisoner. The woman who left the courtroom after her conviction was someone who deserved better than the fate awaiting her, but she was paying for the crimes of someone who probably hadn't. October 16, 1793, 4:30 a.m. Marie Antoinette woke up on her last morning in a damp cell in the conciergerie. knowing she had roughly 8 hours left to live. Most people never have to face such precise awareness of their own mortality. But then again, most people never have to die in front of thousands of screaming spectators either. Her final preparations were conducted with the kind of careful attention to detail that had once characterized her approach to court fashion. Except now she was dressing for her own execution. The irony was perfect. Marie Antoinette, who had spent 20 years being criticized for caring too much about appearances, was about to give the performance of her life in front of the most hostile audience in history. The prison guards had expected to find a broken woman, but instead they found someone who had achieved a kind of transcendent dignity that impressed even the hardest revolutionary hearts. She dressed in simple white, the color of mourning for French royalty, and arranged her grey hair with the unconscious elegance that no amount of elaborate styling had ever achieved. Her last letter, written by candlelight just hours before her execution, was addressed to Madame Elisabeth, and contained some of the most moving words in French literature. She wrote about forgiveness, about love for France, despite everything that had happened, and about her hope that her death might somehow contribute to the peace and happiness of the country that was about to kill her. But perhaps the most remarkable part of her final letter was her lack of bitterness. This woman, who had every reason to curse France and the revolution that had destroyed her family, instead wrote about understanding and compassion. She had become, in her final hours, exactly the kind of person France needed, and exactly the kind of person the revolution couldn't tolerate. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was conducted in a cart rather than a carriage. Revolutionary equality extended even to execution transportation. Marie Antoinette, who had once travelled in elaborate coaches that cost more than houses, now rode to her death like a common criminal. The symbolism was intentional and brutal. But here's what the revolutionary authorities hadn't anticipated. Marie Antoinette's dignity was actually working against their political narrative. The crowds lining the streets had come expecting to see the Austrian bitch finally getting her comeuppance, but instead they saw a composed woman facing death, with remarkable courage. It's harder to celebrate someone's execution when they're handling it better than you probably would. The Place de la Révolution was packed with spectators who had come for what they expected to be the ultimate revolutionary entertainment. The execution of Marie Antoinette was the climax of 4 years of revolutionary violence, the final symbolic destruction of the old regime. This wasn't just about killing one woman, this was about killing everything she represented. The guillotine itself was a masterpiece of Enlightenment engineering applied to the ancient business of execution. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine had designed it to provide quick, painless, egalitarian death, because even capital punishment should reflect democratic values. It was humane, efficient, and completely terrifying in its mechanical precision. Marie Antoinette approached the scaffold with the same careful attention to protocol that had once governed her participation in court ceremonies. She climbed the steps steadily, acknowledged the crowd with a slight nod, and positioned herself for the executioner with the cooperation of someone who understood that dignity in death was the only victory still available to her. The executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, was reportedly impressed by her composure. Here was someone who had spent his career killing people for the state, and he found Marie Antoinette's courage remarkable, even by his professional standards. She faced death with more grace than most people face, minor inconveniences. Her last words were an apology to Sanson for accidentally stepping on his foot as she approached the guillotine. Think about that for a moment. With minutes left to live, surrounded by thousands of people who wanted her dead, Marie Antoinette was still concerned about basic politeness. She had maintained her humanity right up to the moment she lost her head. The execution itself took seconds. The blade fell at 12:15 p.m., and Marie Antoinette's 20-year journey from Austrian Archduchess to French Queen to revolutionary victim was finally over. Sanson held up her severed head to the crowd, which erupted in celebration as if they'd just witnessed the triumph of justice rather than the completion of a very expensive revenge fantasy. But something interesting happened in the immediate aftermath. The crowd's celebration felt forced, almost desperate. The reality of watching a brave woman die had been different from the fantasy of seeing the Austrian bitch get what she deserved. Executing symbols is emotionally satisfying. Executing actual people with dignity and courage is complicated and disturbing. The revolutionary authorities had achieved their immediate political goal. Marie Antoinette was dead. The monarchy was definitively finished, and foreign powers had been sent a clear message about the fate of anyone who opposed the Republic. But they'd also created something they hadn't intended. A martyr whose final dignity made their cause look less like justice and more like vengeance. Marie Antoinette's body was thrown into an unmarked grave with quicklime, the revolutionary equivalent of trying to erase someone from history. But you can't actually erase someone whose final performance was so memorable that even their enemies were impressed. Her death had been intended to end her story, but instead it completed her transformation into legend. The woman who had spent her life being criticized for superficiality had died with substance. The queen who had been accused of caring only for herself had faced death with thoughts for others. The Austrian who had been charged with hating France had died forgiving her executioners and hoping for her country's happiness. Marie Antoinette had finally given France what it needed from its queen, an example of grace under pressure, dignity in defeat, and courage in the face of death. Unfortunately, France had to kill her to get it. October 16, 1793, 12:16 p.m. Marie Antoinette had been dead for exactly 1 minute, but her legend was just being born. The crowd that had gathered to celebrate the execution of the Austrian bitch was slowly beginning to realize they'd just witnessed something more complicated than simple revolutionary justice. The immediate political reaction was exactly what the revolutionary authorities had hoped for. Celebration in the streets, congratulations from Allied republics, and stern warnings to other European monarchs about the fate awaiting enemies of the people. Marie Antoinette's death was supposed to be the final punctuation mark on the sentence of the old regime. Mission accomplished. But something unexpected began happening in the days and weeks following her execution. People who had been there, who had actually watched her die, started telling stories that didn't quite match the official revolutionary narrative. Instead of describing the death of a corrupt foreign enemy, they found themselves describing the courage of a woman facing impossible circumstances with remarkable dignity. The guards at the conciergerie began sharing stories about her final months, how she'd maintained her composure despite terrible conditions, how she'd shown genuine concern for their welfare even though they were her captors, how she'd faced death without self-pity or dramatic breakdown. These weren't the stories of someone who deserved to die. These were the stories of someone who deserved better. Even Charles Henry Sanson, the executioner, couldn't help but comment on her extraordinary courage. This was a man whose job required him to kill people professionally, and he found Marie Antoinette's final performance memorable enough to mention in his memoirs. When your executioner respects your dignity, you've achieved something remarkable. The international reaction was swift and horrified. European courts that had spent years criticizing Marie Antoinette for her frivolity and extravagance suddenly discovered they were outraged by her execution. It's amazing how death can rehabilitate someone's reputation, especially when that death involves a guillotine and a cheering crowd. But the most significant long-term consequence of Marie Antoinette's execution was how it changed the revolutionary narrative itself. The French Revolution had been presented as a triumph of reason, justice, and popular sovereignty over tyranny and oppression. Executing a brave woman who faced death with dignity didn't fit comfortably into that story. Within years, even some revolutionary leaders were expressing private doubts about the necessity of Marie Antoinette's execution. She had been politically powerless for months before her death. Her husband was already dead, and her children were under revolutionary control. Killing her had been symbolic rather than strategic, revenge rather than necessity. The children she left behind became living reminders of the revolution's cruelty. Marie-Thérèse, now an orphan at 15, would eventually be released and become a symbol of aristocratic survival and revolutionary tragedy. Her brother Louis-Charles, the little boy who had been separated from his family and re-educated, died in prison at age 10, under circumstances that still generate historical controversy. The "let them eat cake" myth, which had been used to justify revolutionary hatred during Marie Antoinette's lifetime, took on new meaning after her death. People began to understand that she'd never actually said it, which meant they'd been hating her for something she hadn't done. The fake quote became a symbol of how political propaganda can create reality that survives even after the truth is revealed. Napoleonic France began the process of Marie Antoinette's historical rehabilitation. Bonaparte, who understood the political value of reconciliation, allowed some acknowledgement that perhaps the revolution had gone too far in its treatment of the royal family. It was politically safe to express sympathy for Marie Antoinette once the monarchy was definitively dead and buried. The Bourbon Restoration made Marie Antoinette into an official martyr, complete with elaborate ceremonies to honor her memory and relocate her remains to a proper royal tomb. She became a symbol of royal suffering and revolutionary excess, which was politically useful for monarchs trying to re-establish their legitimacy after years of Republican government. But the most interesting development was how Marie Antoinette's reputation began to evolve, based on what people needed her to represent. To conservatives, she became a symbol of traditional values destroyed by dangerous radicalism. To romantics, she became a tragic heroine, destroyed by political forces beyond her control. To feminists, she became an example of how women are scapegoated for political problems created by men. The historical Marie Antoinette, the actual woman who lived and died, began to disappear behind the various legends that different groups found useful. She became simultaneously a frivolous spendthrift and a dignified martyr, a foreign enemy and a French victim, a symbol of aristocratic excess and an example of human courage. Popular culture embraced Marie Antoinette with enthusiasm that would have surprised her revolutionary executioners. Novels, plays, operas, and eventually films turned her story into entertainment for the very kinds of people who had once demanded her death. She became more famous dead than she'd ever been alive. The irony was perfect. Marie Antoinette, who had spent her life being criticized for caring too much about public opinion, achieved her greatest public relations triumph by dying well. Her execution, intended to destroy her reputation forever, instead guaranteed her historical immortality. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of her posthumous fame is how it obscures the actual woman who lived through those impossible circumstances. The legend of Marie Antoinette, whether positive or negative, has become more powerful than the historical reality of Marie Antoinette. She wanted to be loved during her lifetime, and instead became a symbol. She achieved love after her death, but only by becoming a different kind of symbol. Marie Antoinette's greatest tragedy wasn't that she was executed. It was that she was never really allowed to exist as simply a human being, trying to navigate impossible circumstances with whatever dignity she could manage. The revolution killed Marie Antoinette, but it created the Marie Antoinette legend. And legends, as history demonstrates, are much harder to kill than people. So who was Marie Antoinette, really? Strip away the revolutionary propaganda, the royalist mythology, the Hollywood glamorization, and the feminist reinterpretation. What's left is a woman whose life reads like a masterclass in how historical circumstances can transform ordinary human flaws into legendary crimes. She was, fundamentally, someone who never chose her own life. From the moment of her birth as the 15th child of Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette existed to serve other people's political purposes. Her marriage, her residence, her role, her daily schedule, everything was determined by diplomatic necessity rather than personal preference. She was living someone else's script from day one. But here's what makes her story fascinating rather than just tragic. Within those impossible constraints, she kept trying to be human. She wanted friendship, so she befriended Yolande de Polignac, despite the political complications. She wanted excitement, so she gambled enormous sums despite the financial implications. She wanted beauty, so she commissioned elaborate dresses despite the social consequences. Every normal human desire became a political liability because she was royal and foreign during a time when being royal and foreign was becoming dangerous. Marie Antoinette's tragedy wasn't that she was a bad person. It was that she was an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances that turned ordinary vices into capital crimes. The gambling, for instance, wasn't unusual behavior for 18th century aristocrats. Card games with high stakes were standard entertainment at every European court. But when Marie Antoinette gambled, she was gambling French money during a French financial crisis, while being perceived as an Austrian agent. Context transformed recreation into treason. The fashion obsession makes perfect sense when you understand her position. Marie Antoinette had no real political power, no meaningful work, no independent income, and no privacy. Fashion was one of the few areas where she could exercise creative control and personal expression. Her elaborate dresses weren't just vanity, they were her only form of artistic and individual freedom. The friendship with Polignac was probably the healthiest relationship in Marie Antoinette's adult life. A genuine emotional connection based on mutual affection rather than political calculation. But healthy personal relationships were dangerous for someone whose every social interaction was scrutinized for political implications. She was being criticized for experiencing normal human intimacy. Even her maternal devotion became politically problematic. Marie Antoinette loved her children with the intensity of someone who'd waited years to become a mother, and then faced the possibility of losing them to revolution and illness. But royal mothers were supposed to be symbolically maternal, not actually maternal. Her genuine love for her children was interpreted as neglect of her symbolic duties to France. The most heartbreaking aspect of Marie Antoinette's story is how her attempts to find happiness within her constraints were systematically reframed as evidence of her unfitness for her role. She wasn't allowed to be unhappy. That would be ungrateful. But she also wasn't allowed to be happy. That would be insensitive. She was trapped in an emotional catch-22 that would have driven anyone to desperate behavior. Her political ignorance, which was genuine and significant, was also completely predictable given her background and education. Marie Antoinette was trained to be decorative and charming, not analytical and strategic. When France needed political wisdom from its queen, she literally didn't have the skills because no one had ever thought to teach them to her. But here's what's remarkable. When she finally faced real crisis, she did develop those skills. The Marie Antoinette of 1792, 1793, demonstrated political sophistication, strategic thinking, and personal courage that would have served her well if she'd discovered them 20 years earlier. Facing death apparently concentrated her mind wonderfully. The sexual rumors that dogged her throughout her life were almost certainly false, but they were believable because her marriage was so obviously unfulfilling. Marie Antoinette was a young, attractive woman, married to a man who seemed more interested in locks than in her. The assumption that she must be finding satisfaction elsewhere was logical, even if it was incorrect. Her relationship with Axel von Fersen remains historically ambiguous, but whether it was romantic or platonic is almost beside the point. What matters is that it represented emotional support during a period when she desperately needed it. She was entitled to human companionship, regardless of whether that companionship included physical intimacy. The Austrian committee accusations were both unfair and understandable. Marie Antoinette did maintain contact with Austrian officials, and she did hope for foreign intervention to save the monarchy. But these weren't acts of treason. They were acts of desperation by someone watching her family face extinction. When your own country wants to kill you, reaching out to foreign relatives seems like basic survival instinct. Perhaps most importantly, Marie Antoinette was never given the opportunity to learn from her mistakes and grow into her role. Most people get to make errors privately and adjust their behavior accordingly. Marie Antoinette's every mistake was public, permanent, and politically weaponized. She was never allowed to evolve or mature because her reputation was fixed by her enemies' propaganda. By the time she had developed wisdom, dignity, and genuine political understanding, it was too late to save her life, but not too late to save her honor. The Marie Antoinette who died in 1793 was someone who deserved better than the fate that awaited her, but she was paying for the crimes of the person she used to be. She was a woman who wanted to be loved, and ended up being hated for wanting it. She was a queen who tried to be human, and was punished for succeeding. She was a foreigner who never really became French but died hoping for France's happiness. She was, in the end, exactly what her impossible circumstances had made her, a tragic figure whose personal flaws were magnified by historical forces beyond her control or understanding. Marie Antoinette's real crime wasn't political treason or moral corruption. It was being herself at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Let's talk about the impossible math of Marie Antoinette's existence. Take one teenage girl, add unlimited wealth, and zero real power, multiply by international political pressure, divide by lack of privacy, and subtract any possibility of normal human relationships. The result is an equation that can only end in tragedy, no matter how you solve it. Marie Antoinette's story is ultimately about the price of being human in a role that demanded she be superhuman. She was expected to be politically wise without political education, emotionally supportive without emotional support, financially responsible without financial knowledge, and personally flawless while living under microscopic scrutiny. It's an impossible standard that would have destroyed anyone. But what makes her story particularly tragic is how her very humanity, the qualities that make people sympathetic and relatable, became the evidence used to condemn her. Her desire for friendship was reframed as political favoritism. Her need for excitement became reckless gambling. Her love for beauty was transformed into contempt for suffering. Every human impulse was weaponized against her. Consider the fundamental contradiction at the heart of her position. She was simultaneously the most powerful woman in France, and completely powerless to control her own life. She could commission dresses that cost fortunes, but couldn't choose whom to marry. She could grant titles and estates to favorites, but couldn't leave her palace without permission. She had unlimited access to luxury and zero access to freedom. The gambling makes perfect sense in this context. When you have no real control over your circumstances, the artificial control provided by card games becomes psychologically necessary. Marie Antoinette could win or lose based on her own choices and skills rather than diplomatic negotiations and political calculations. Gambling was her only experience of genuine agency. The fashion obsession was similar. It represented one of the few areas where she could exercise creative control and personal expression. In a life where everything else was determined by protocol and politics, clothing became her canvas for individual identity. The elaborate dresses weren't just vanity. They were her declaration that she existed as a person, rather than just a political symbol. Her friendship with Yolande Polignac was probably the healthiest relationship in her adult life, which is exactly why it was so politically dangerous. Genuine affection based on mutual compatibility, rather than strategic advantage, was a luxury that royal women weren't supposed to enjoy. She was being criticized for experiencing normal human intimacy in abnormal circumstances. The maternal devotion that characterized her later years was both her greatest strength and her most vulnerable weakness. Marie Antoinette loved her children with the intensity of someone who'd waited years to become a mother and then faced the possibility of losing them to politics and illness. But royal children belonged to the state as much as to their parents, and her attempts to protect them were interpreted as selfish prioritization of personal feelings over public duty. Even her physical appearance became politically charged. Marie Antoinette was naturally beautiful, which should have been an asset, but in revolutionary France, beauty became evidence of moral corruption. Her elegant bearing, which had been cultivated through years of court training, was reinterpreted as arrogant indifference to common suffering. She couldn't win because the game itself was rigged against her survival. The sexual accusations that followed her throughout her life were particularly cruel, because they targeted the one area where she was genuinely vulnerable: her unfulfilled marriage. Marie Antoinette was trapped in a sexless relationship with a man who seemed more interested in mechanical engineering than in her. But any attempt to find emotional or physical satisfaction elsewhere would have been grounds for execution. She was damned for being neglected and damned for seeking comfort. The Austrian origins that defined her entire French experience were something she had no control over whatsoever. Marie Antoinette didn't choose to be born Austrian any more than she chose to marry into the French royal family. But her nationality became the lens through which every action was interpreted, transforming normal behavior into evidence of foreign conspiracy. She was being punished for circumstances that preceded her birth. Perhaps most tragically, Marie Antoinette was never given the opportunity to learn and grow from her mistakes in private. Most people get to make errors, face consequences, and adjust their behavior accordingly, without public scrutiny. Every mistake Marie Antoinette made was documented, publicized, and permanently added to the case against her character. She was never allowed to evolve because her reputation was fossilized by her enemies' propaganda. The financial crisis that ultimately destroyed the monarchy wasn't caused by Marie Antoinette's spending, but her spending became the symbol of royal excess, because it was visible and comprehensible in ways that complex economic policy wasn't. It's easier to hate someone for buying expensive dresses than to understand the systemic problems that had been building for decades before she was even born. By the time Marie Antoinette had developed genuine wisdom, political understanding, and personal dignity, it was too late to save her life. The woman who faced execution in 1793 was someone who had learned from her experiences and grown into someone genuinely admirable. But she was paying for the crimes of the person she used to be, rather than being judged for the person she had become. The revolution needed Marie Antoinette to be a monster to justify her execution, but the reality was more complicated and more human. She was someone whose ordinary human flaws were magnified by extraordinary circumstances until they became legendary vices. Her real crime wasn't political treason or moral corruption. It was being insufficiently perfect in a role that demanded perfection, while providing no preparation for achieving it. Marie Antoinette's tragedy is that she was punished for being human in a world that needed her to be a symbol. She wanted love, friendship, beauty, and meaning, completely normal desires that became dangerous when expressed by someone in her impossible position. She died not for being evil, but for being authentically, vulnerably, imperfectly human. Here's the final irony of Marie Antoinette's story. She achieved in death what had eluded her in life. She became genuinely interesting. Not the artificial interest of court gossip or political scandal, but the deep lasting fascination that comes from watching someone navigate impossible circumstances with imperfect grace and ultimate dignity. We're still talking about her more than 2 centuries later, which is remarkable when you consider that she held real political power for less than 20 years, and spent most of that time being criticized for using it incorrectly. Kings and emperors who conquered continents are footnotes in history books, but the Austrian princess who never quite learned to be French enough has become immortal. But what exactly are we fascinated by? It's not her political achievements. She had none worth mentioning. It's not her intellectual contributions. She left no lasting ideas or innovations. It's not even her tragic death. Plenty of people have been unjustly executed without achieving legendary status. What makes Marie Antoinette eternally compelling is how thoroughly human she remained under inhuman pressure. She represents something that resonates across centuries and cultures: the struggle to maintain personal identity while fulfilling impossible social expectations. Every teenager who's ever felt misunderstood, every woman who's been criticized for enjoying herself, every person who's been blamed for circumstances beyond their control, sees something familiar in Marie Antoinette's story. The let them eat cake myth persists not because it's historically accurate, but because it perfectly captures how we imagine powerful people respond to suffering they don't understand. It doesn't matter that Marie Antoinette never said it. It matters that we believe someone in her position might have said it, and that belief reveals more about our assumptions than about her character. Modern popular culture has embraced Marie Antoinette with enthusiasm that would have amused her critics and probably confused her supporters. She's been the subject of countless novels, films, musicals, and fashion exhibitions. Sofia Coppola's 2006 film reimagined her as a lonely teenager trapped in an adult world of political intrigue and social performance, which is probably closer to the historical reality than most scholarly biographies. The fashion industry has particular affection for Marie Antoinette, because she represents the ultimate expression of style, as personal statement. Her elaborate dresses and hairstyles weren't just clothing, they were wearable manifestos about the importance of beauty, creativity, and individual expression. She turned fashion into art, and art into rebellion against the limitations of her role. But perhaps the most interesting development in Marie Antoinette's posthumous reputation is how different groups have claimed her as a symbol for their own causes. Feminists see her as a victim of misogyny, who was scapegoated for problems created by men. Conservatives view her as a martyr to traditional values destroyed by dangerous radicalism. Libertarians embrace her as someone who refused to conform to social expectations about appropriate behavior. Each interpretation contains elements of truth, which is why Marie Antoinette remains compelling to audiences. With completely different political perspectives, she's simultaneously a victim and a rebel, a conservative symbol and a progressive icon, a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Her story is flexible enough to accommodate multiple meanings without losing its essential emotional impact. The children she died trying to protect became living reminders of both revolutionary cruelty and royal resilience. Marie-Thérèse survived to become the Duchess of Angoulême, carrying her parents' memory into the 19th century and ensuring that Marie Antoinette's story would be preserved by someone who had actually lived through it. Louis Charles died in prison, becoming a symbol of innocence destroyed by political hatred. Modern France has gradually made peace with Marie Antoinette's memory. Versailles, once the symbol of royal excess that sparked revolutionary hatred, is now one of the country's most popular tourist destinations. Visitors come to see the apartments where she lived, the gardens where she walked, and the Petit Trianon where she tried to create a space for personal happiness within the constraints of royal duty. The conciergerie, where she spent her final months, has been preserved as both a tourist attraction and a memorial. Her cell has been restored, and visitors can stand where she stood while awaiting execution. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly circumstances can change, and how dignity in extremity can transform someone from a historical footnote into an eternal symbol. But what would Marie Antoinette think of her posthumous fame? She wanted to be loved during her lifetime, and was instead hated. She achieved love after her death, but only by becoming a symbol rather than being remembered as a person. She might have appreciated the irony. Her greatest public relations triumph came from dying well rather than living well. The revolution that killed her was supposed to create a new world based on reason, equality, and popular sovereignty. Instead, it created the conditions for Napoleon's dictatorship and eventually the restoration of the very monarchy it had tried to destroy. Marie Antoinette didn't live to see the failure of the revolutionary experiment, but her death became one of its defining moments. In the end, Marie Antoinette's story transcends the specific historical circumstances that created it. She represents the eternal human struggle between individual desires and social expectations, between personal happiness and public duty, between being authentic and being acceptable. Her tragedy was being forced to choose between being human and being royal, and her triumph was choosing humanity even when it cost her everything. She died as Marie Antoinette, but she lives on as a reminder that, behind every crown, every title, and every symbol of power, there's a person trying to navigate impossible circumstances with whatever dignity they can manage, and sometimes, that's enough to achieve immortality. Marie Antoinette never got to write her own story, but maybe that's why we keep rewriting it for her. Every generation rediscovers her tragedy and finds something new to admire, condemn, or understand. She wanted to be remembered fondly, and 2 centuries later we're still deciding how we feel about her.